I want to try and understand the magnitude of improvement here. When you talk about scaling something like Bitcoin, what is that potential for improvement when it comes to transaction throughput that could be achieved from validity rollups?
That's a good question. And it really depends on the implementation details of the rollup that gets built on Bitcoin. But in my report, I talk about basically three different types of rollups. One is an account model rollup. Another is a UTXO model rollup. And the third is a shielded UTXO model rollup. So I'll explain what each of those different models is and the differences between them. So I'll start with the UTXO model rollup because your listeners are probably most familiar with UTXO model blockchains because Bitcoin itself is a UTXO model blockchain. So this is where coins are represented as unspent transaction outputs. That's what a UTXO stands for. And users basically own collections of unspent transaction outputs. And then when they want to make a transaction, they will select some of those UTXOs as inputs for their transaction. And then they will define the recipient and potentially a change address, which will create new UTXOs from their transaction. So those are the outputs of their transaction. So you've got inputs, which are UTXOs that the user already owns, or maybe somebody that they're collaborating with to create the transaction already owns. And then you've got outputs, which are all of the destination addresses. This is a great way to run a blockchain because you're able to parallelize a lot of operations. But it also produces a lot of information about the transactions because you might have multiple inputs, you might have multiple outputs, and this is just adding data to your transactions. An account model rollup will reduce the amount of data that is needed for a simple spend transaction because there's only a single sender address and a single recipient address. And rather than a user owning collections of unspent transaction outputs, they just own an account. And that account has a balance. And when they spend money, their balance on that account is simply debited to take money out of their account and transfer it to a different account. And so the way that you can communicate these debit operations is very simple. You just have, Alice sends X number of Bitcoins to Bob. It's like a very small, succinct amount of information. And using some compression tricks, you're able to compress that amount of information down to as little as like 12 bytes per transaction, compared to a similar UTXO model transaction, which might be more like 150 or 200 bytes. So that's already over or less than 10% of the size of like a UTXO model transaction. And then the third blockchain state model that I mentioned was the shielded UTXO rollup. And the shielded UTXO rollup is basically a way to encrypt your transactions. You apply zero knowledge end-to-end encryption to your transaction so that the sender addresses, the recipient addresses, and the amount of Bitcoin that is being sent are not publicly visible on the blockchain. The transaction just looks like a bunch of ciphertext on the blockchain. because it's encrypted. The trade-off that you're making is that these transactions are much larger in size in terms of like their bytes. So those transactions are like 600 or 700 bytes at a minimum. And so they're a few times larger, but you're able to get so much more privacy from those kinds of transactions, because all of your transaction details or most of your transaction metadata is end-to-end encrypted. So it might be worth the trade-off to pay a little bit more for those kinds of transactions because you're getting so much more privacy. And so when you look at these different roll-up models, and there are other models that people could come up with, I'm sure. But I look at these because these are like easy frames of reference for people. You've got the really small transactions. You've got the transactions that are closer in size to like Bitcoin transactions today. And then you've got transactions that are a little bit larger, at least in terms of raw bytes that end up inside of a block. And what I suggest in my paper, in the report, is that we could actually apply the witness discount that was introduced with SegWit to all of this roll-up transaction data. And the reason why I suggest doing that, or suggest that it might be acceptable, is because layer 1 full nodes don't need to replay any of these transactions. So there is no additional computational cost to putting these transactions into a layer 1 block. They do have to store this data, but storage is generally considered cheaper than computation. And so, or it's less of a bottleneck than computation when it comes to scaling. And so if we apply the witness discount to all of this transaction data, then actually the shielded rollup transactions end up just being a little bit bigger in terms of weight units, which is how Bitcoin transaction capacity is technically measured in Bitcoin now. So the weight units or the weight of a shielded rollup transaction is just a little bit bigger than like a normal 1 input, 2 output UTXO transaction that you would do on layer 1 Bitcoin today. Like those transactions are about 500 bytes. And like I said, the rollup transactions are 600 or 700 bytes. The shielded rollup transactions. And then the normal UTXO rollup transactions, if you apply the witness discount, they're only about 170 bytes compared to the 500 bytes of a layer 1 UTXO transaction. So you could, it's about 3 or 4 times more transactions per block for a normal UTXO model rollup if you apply the witness discount to that data. And then if you take the account model rollup with those small 12-byte transactions and you apply the witness discount to that data, then you could fit as much as, say, 250,000 transactions per block compared to 2,000 to 3,000 transactions, UTXO model transactions, which you might fit in a layer 1 Bitcoin block today. So it's a much greater, approximately 100x, throughput improvement for the account model transactions in the rollup.